Hey, 42 here. 500 years ago, a tiny band of Spanish conquistadors landed in what is now Peru, and between them, they toppled one of the largest and most powerful empires on the planet. As for how, that's what we're going to find out in this video. But in case you can't wait that long, let me give you the gist. The Spanish conquered the Inca thanks to a monumental stroke of luck, a room full of solid gold, an out-of-control bioweapon, and what might just be the greatest ambush in military history. This is the truly remarkable story of how 168 men conquered an empire of 10 million. This is the story of the fall of the Inca. In early 1532, the Inca Empire was one of the biggest and most advanced on Earth. Home to around 10 million people and covering an area of more than 2.5 million square kilometers, it was by far the largest empire ever to exist in pre-Columbian America. It was well organized, had advanced politics and fearsome military power, and Inca engineering would have impressed even Europeans. The Inca rulers of the age had every reason to believe their glorious civilization would continue to grow and prosper for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. And yet, just 18 months later, the Inca emperor was dead, and his mighty empire was in ruins. Considering the Inca's wealth and influence, the speed of this demise is nothing short of astonishing. But even more remarkable is how it happened. Because the Inca weren't beaten by a mighty invading army or an apocalypse-grade natural disaster. No, they were defeated by precisely 168 Spaniards. Now, I know what you're thinking, that is literally impossible. And trust me, I get it. I've put dozens of hours of research into this topic and I still have trouble believing it. But what I'm going to tell you in this video is well-established historical fact. Now, if you follow this channel regularly, you'll know that the Spanish had already had a bit of practice conquering powerful New World civilizations in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. A decade before taking on the Inca, a chap called Hernan Cortez had done a number on the fearsome Aztecs in what is now Mexico. That experience had taught the Spanish plenty about the vast differences between their culture and those of the New World. But it had also taught them that they had something in common. They both bloody loved gold. Gold was the fuel of the Spanish Empire. It paid for armies, bought noble titles, and directly translated into unimaginable wealth. They got a great deal of it during their conquest of the Aztecs. But like the AU addicts they were going to need some more, and fast. Luckily, they had a pretty good idea of where to look. As far back as the early 1500s, there had been rumours of a large, and more importantly, rich kingdom somewhere to the south. No sooner had the Aztecs been defeated, the Spanish started trying to find it. There were several expeditions to what we now call South America in those early days, but the most important ones for the purposes of this story were led by Francisco Pizarro. A man born to humble beginnings, Pizarro had gone to the New World in his 30s in search of a better life. To some extent, he found one, rising through the ranks to serve as the mayor of Panama City. But he hadn't travelled halfway across the world to become a bureaucrat. His ambitions were far loftier. In 1524, he and fellow wannabe conquistador Diego Almagro led an expedition south from Panama City along the Pacific coast in search of the wealthy civilization that was rumoured to exist there. Unfortunately for them, they didn't find it. Instead, they found treacherous swamps, an impressive variety of tropical diseases, and lots of angry locals who were quite keen to murder them. The expedition was an unmitigated disaster. 0 square miles of territory were claimed for the Spanish crown. Not a single ounce of gold was stolen, I mean liberated, and lots of Spaniards died in various horrific ways. When co-commander Diego Almagro lost an eye to an arrow in a skirmish in what is now Colombia, they decided it was probably best to go home. But neither Francisco Pizarro nor Diego Almagro were men who gave up easily. Pizarro in particular was relentless. Perhaps because conquering giant new world civilizations with bugger all men was in his blood. Pizarro was the second cousin once removed from Hernan Cortés, the man who'd defeated the Aztecs with just 500 men. That family's got a lot to answer for. Anyway, 2 years after their disastrous first expedition, Pizarro and Almagro were back for another bite of the guava. This time with almost double the manpower and even a few horses. To begin with, the second expedition went pretty much the same way as the first. Swamps were traversed, diseases were died from, and far from finding a vast, wealthy civilization, the Spanish found little more than the odd primitive village. But Pizarro and Almagro's fortunes changed dramatically thanks to a chance encounter somewhere off the coast of what is now Ecuador. That's where one of their ships came across a large raft floating serenely through the treacherous waters of the Pacific Ocean. At first, this raft appeared to be little more than an insignificant curiosity. At more than 10 meters long and 6 wide, it looked absolutely nothing like any kind of ocean-going vessel the Spanish had ever set eyes on. But it wasn't the raft itself that changed Pizarro and Almagro's fortunes. It was what the raft was carrying. Gold. The apparently primitive craft was full of the stuff, as well as silver, emeralds, fine textiles, and pottery. By this point, the Spanish had a few young natives amongst their crew to act as translators, so communication, though difficult, was just about possible. The men on the raft claimed to be traders from a large, wealthy port city to the south called Tumbes, part of a vast, rich empire. During the garbled conversation, one word in particular came up a lot: Inca. Though Spanish chroniclers of the time recorded it as Inga. The word referred to the leader of this great empire, Inca literally meaning ruler or emperor. But over the years, it became the Western name for the entire civilization. In case you're wondering, the people we now call the Inca refer to themselves as the Tahuantinsuyu. And no, that probably isn't how you pronounce it. Anyway, the discovery of this pimped out raft was exactly the proof Pizarro and Almagro had been looking for. But by this point, supplies were running critically low, and many of the men were suffering from a range of ailments and injuries. In other words, they were in no shape to head out conquering. Instead, Pizarro and Almagro did the 16th century equivalent of calling for backup by sending a ship back to Panama to request more food and men. But to their surprise, the request was denied. The Spanish colony of Panama had never been wealthy, and the governor, Pedro de los Rios, had had enough of funding expensive and so far fruitless expeditions to the south. So, rather than send the support Pizarro and Almagro had asked for, he ordered that they sail home immediately. Almagro reluctantly complied, but Pizarro refused. He'd found a solid lead suggesting that the next great New World civilization was lurking somewhere to the south, just waiting for a brave Spaniard to come along and conquer it. So rather than head back to Panama City, Pizarro made a very bold and, as we'll soon find out, very stupid play. Gathering what remained of his men, he offered them a choice. Either they could sail back to Panama with their tails between their legs, or they could stay with him to seek fortune and glory to the south. His inspiring speech complete, Pizarro waited for the inevitable flood of men to rush to his side. But apparently, he wasn't much of a public speaker, because just 13 agreed to join his mini rebellion. The rest hopped on board the nearest ship and buggered off home. That left Pizarro in a bit of a predicament. Actually, it left him in a lot of a predicament. The Spanish were the undisputed masters of toppling entire civilizations with just a handful of men. But even for them, 14 was pushing it. So, with progress towards his main quest now essentially impossible, Pizarro and his micro-army were forced to take on a side quest: survive alone in enemy territory for 7 months. They did not have a good time. At first, they set up base on Isla de Gallo, which is basically a tiny island separated from what is now Colombia by a narrow tidal inlet. But it very quickly became clear that long-term survival there was impossible. There was no fresh water to drink, food was scarce, and the men were constantly harassed by local tribes. Pizarro and co. were forced to beat a hasty and extremely dangerous retreat by building a crude wooden canoe and paddling it more than 100 kilometers up the coast to a small island they'd spotted on the way from Panama. Life there was terrible. There was at least fresh water, but food was still in short supply, and the men often went hungry. They had no tools to work the land, and no materials to build shelter from the relentless tropical downpours. And whilst thankfully no humans lived on the island, plenty of other things did. There were so many venomous snakes that Pizarro dubbed their new home La Isla Gorgona, a reference to the snake-head gorgons of Greek mythology. It still bears that name to this day. Pizarro and his men fully expected to die in snake hell. But after 7 brutal months Bear Grillsing it out on Gorgona, they were unexpectedly rescued by Diego Almagro and taken back to Panama. Given what they'd been through, you might expect that Pizarro and his fellow castaways, known these days as the famous 13, would have been keen to put their feet up for a bit, preferably somewhere warm, dry, and 100% snake-free. But, remarkably, 7 months marooned in hell had done absolutely nothing to dampen their desires to venture south in search of riches. Diego Almagro was equally keen to get back out there too. But the governor of Panama was just as determined as ever to block any further expeditions. And this is where Francisco Pizarro executed a negotiating tactic so effective, it's still used in workplaces all over the world, even today. What do you do when your boss won't let you do something that you really want to do? Easy, you go and ask his boss instead. In this case, the governor of Panama's boss was a chap called Charles. Or to give him his full title, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, Archduke of Austria, and King of Spain. Pizarro sailed back to his homeland in 1528 to convince King Charles to approve a third expedition to South America. It's clear Pizarro understood his audience, because he made sure to bring plenty of gold and gemstones captured from the Tumbes raft along with him. Given that Charles V was basically gold member from Austin Powers in a big fancy crown, Pizarro's request was granted immediately. But he was given far more than the simple green light to launch a third expedition. By virtue of a royal decree called the Capitulation of Toledo, Pizarro was granted the governorship of a brand new province to be known as New Castile, that would stretch from the border of Panama some 200 Spanish leagues, or just over 1,000 kilometers, along the Peruvian coast. He was also granted the title of Adelantado, made Captain General of the new region, and given a big fat salary to go with it. It was everything Pizarro had dreamt of, and more. But, ironically enough, it would also prove to be the death of him. Literally. Though not for the reasons you might think, more on that later in the video. As the proud new owner of a big old chunk of South America, Pizarro sailed straight back to Panama to give the tens of millions of locals the good news. In January 1531, he embarked on his third and final expedition. His target was Tumbes, the wealthy coastal trade hub mentioned by the Pimp My Rafters. It was a distance of about 1,300 kilometers as the crow flies, but it would take them more than a year as they battled currents, storms, and whenever they were forced to make landfall, the locals. The expedition finally reached Tumbes in the spring of 1532, but the city was not at all what any of them had expected. Actually, that's not quite true. In many ways, Tumbes was exactly what they had expected. A large, advanced settlement with stone buildings and paved roads. There was just one problem. it was in ruins. Much of Tumbes had been burnt, and it was mostly abandoned. Its buildings damaged and its plazas eerily empty. Whatever had happened here, it was recent, and it was violent. Pizarro would find out the gory details soon enough, but for now, he was forced to improvise. He'd originally planned to make first contact with these Inca at Tumbes, but that clearly wasn't going to happen on account of everyone being dead. Instead, like the first settler in a game of Civ, he started scouting about looking for a good place to found a city. The spot he chose was here, and he named the settlement San Miguel de Piura. It was the very first Spanish settlement in what we now call Peru. More importantly, it was also the first Spanish settlement within the borders of the mighty Inca Empire. The stage had been set. Confrontation was inevitable. But to begin with, things were surprisingly amicable. There were no dramatic standoffs, no full-blooded assaults, no confrontations of any kind. In fact, it was completely the opposite. When the Inca finally came, they were bearing gifts. Turns out they'd been aware of the Spanish for some time and had only been waiting for the right time to introduce themselves. That time had apparently come, because along with the gifts, the Inca envoys brought a message. Actually, an invitation. The leader of his great empire was keen to meet them. Pizarro was naturally delighted. Page 1 in How to Conquer New World Civs for Dummies clearly stated that the first thing to do was figure out who was in charge so you could try and kill him. According to the envoys, the Inca emperor was hanging out at some hot springs, about 350 kilometers to the east. Pizarro gathered his men and set off at once. The journey would take them 2 grueling months as they trekked across deserts, forded rivers, and wound their way up steep Andean valleys. Eventually, they made it to a highlands town called Cajamarca, and it was around this time that Francisco Pizarro realized he'd fucked up. Because camped not far away from the city were approximately 80,000 fearsome Inca warriors. Despite having just 168 men at his disposal, Pizarro had come into the highlands with conquest on his mind. Everything he'd heard about the Inca Empire indicated it was on the big side, but never in his worst nightmares had he expected to be outnumbered almost 500 to 1. Now, clearly, I would have made a terrible conquistador because I would have hopped on the nearest horse and legged it. But apparently, Francisco Pizarro was made of sterner stuff, because far from fleeing, he led his men into town and sent a messenger into the giant Inca camp to request an audience with the emperor. These 2 utterly mismatched forces would do battle the very next day. Now, if the bookies had been taking odds at this point, they'd probably have put a Spanish victory at about a gazillion to 1. But we already know how this story ends. Somehow, the Inca were beaten at Cajamarca, and ultimately, utterly defeated soon afterwards. But how is it physically possible for 168 men to defeat an army of 80,000, let alone go on to conquer an empire of 10 million? Well, to answer that question properly, we're going to have to back up a bit, because despite the incredible show of martial strength at Cajamarca, not all was quite as it seemed in the Inca Empire. As we've already seen, Pizarro and his men were the first Spaniards ever to enter Inca lands. But it turns out the Spanish had, completely by accident, sent a deadly vanguard deep into Inca territory, long before Pizarro even arrived. But this invading force wasn't military in nature, it was viral. If you see my video on the fall of the neighboring Aztec Empire, you'll already know that old world diseases, including measles, influenza, and particularly smallpox, wreaked absolute havoc when unwittingly unleashed in the New World. Europeans had developed some level of resistance to these diseases thanks to generations of natural selection. But the people of the New World had never been exposed. And that made old world diseases unimaginably deadly. After the fall of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, in 1521, it took the Spanish a good decade or so to establish a presence in Inca territory. But smallpox had made far swifter progress south. Hitching a ride along well-trodden trade routes, this deadly disease is thought to have reached South America as early as 1524. The Spanish didn't know it, but they, or at least their diseases, had been killing Inca by the tens of thousands long before Pizarro ever engaged them in battle. Smallpox tore through the Andes like a ghost army, killing indiscriminately. Nobody was safe from this silent killer, not even the emperor of the Inca himself. Now for a quick ad from Surfshark. So a few weeks back, I was working in a coffee shop on their Wi-Fi, chatting with a work colleague over messages, and then it hit me. I was talking about some pretty sensitive stuff, and I had no idea who else was on that network or what they could see. And it's not just dodgy Wi-Fi. Shopping online, checking your bank, even just browsing. Every one of these everyday things involves real risks to your security and privacy. That's why I use Surfshark. Surfshark is a cybersecurity company that effortlessly secures you online. Surfshark VPN keeps your online activity private by hiding your IP address, and it encrypts your data so your activity is much harder to track. For me, that means I can check my banking on public Wi-Fi without thinking twice, stream my home shows when I'm traveling abroad, and dodge the sneaky price hikes that some shopping sites slap on you based on your location. Yes, that really happens. But Surfshark is more than a VPN. It protects your connection, devices, and personal info all in one place. One subscription covers everything. Surfshark Alert pings you the second your data shows up in a leak, and the built-in ad blocker kills ads and trackers across the board. One account covers unlimited devices, so your whole household is sorted on one plan. So go to surfshark.com/42 or use code 42 at checkout, and you'll get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN free, with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's literally nothing to lose. Links in the description. You see, the mysterious and all-powerful ruler that invited Pizarro and his men to meet him at Cajamarca was actually extremely new to the job. His predecessor, a man called Huayna Capac, who had ruled the Inca for almost 35 years, had died from what was almost certainly smallpox in 1527. Huayna Capac's son and heir also died, again from smallpox, just a few weeks later. Between them, those two deaths left a power vacuum right at the top of the Inca imperial hierarchy, a vacuum that would ultimately shatter the empire. Now, succession wars are complicated affairs in most cultures, but for the Inca, they were especially challenging, because apparently swimming in gold like Scrooge McDuck wasn't the only thing the Inca rulers liked to do with their spare time. According to most estimates, Huayna Capac is thought to have fathered, somewhere in the region, of 250 children. Admittedly, most of those had no real claim to the Inca throne, having been born either to lesser wives or concubines, but there were still plenty of viable candidates, and the empire was quickly plunged into chaos as various parties vied for the right to rule, with 2 of Huayna Capac's children eventually emerging as the most likely candidates. In the red corner was Huascar. Born to Huayna Capac's principal wife and sister, yikes, he was backed by the nobility in the empire's capital, Cusco. In the blue corner was Atahualpa. Although he was also one of Huayna Capac's sons, the other half of his lineage was somewhat murky. On the surface, that made his claim to the throne less convincing, but crucially, he had the backing of many of the Inca's best generals. Neither man was prepared to back down, which meant what happened next was absolutely inevitable. All-out civil war. The Inca Civil War raged for 3 long years, and at various times both sides appeared to be on top. In the end, it was Atahualpa who got the W, but victory had come at a massive cost. The nobility had been fractured, the army battered, and many of the best Inca generals were dead. The citizens were tired, and everywhere you looked, loyalties were divided. There's a reason Tumbes was in ruins when Pizarro found it. The Inca had torn it apart, all by themselves. Add on to all of this the utter devastation wrought by the smallpox epidemic, and despite the apparent show of strength at Cajamarca, when Pizarro turned up in 1532, the Inca were far weaker and more vulnerable than they had ever been before. Pizarro didn't know it, but he had arrived at, quite literally, the perfect point in history to take on the Inca, almost down to the month. By the time they met in battle, Atahualpa had likely ruled the Inca for under 6 months. He was only in Cajamarca at the first place to recover at the hot springs after finally defeating Cusco in battle. For Pizarro, it was a genuinely mind-boggling stroke of luck. Despite the battered state of his new empire, when Atahualpa had heard that a band of white men had entered his lands, he couldn't have been any less concerned. His scouts had confirmed the Spaniards' puny numbers, and far from being afraid, Atahualpa's overriding emotion was simple curiosity. With the benefit of hindsight, inviting the Spanish to stroll right into the heart of his kingdom unchallenged seemed like madness. But Atahualpa was not a stupid man. In fact, everything we know about him suggests he was a capable and charismatic leader, and inviting the Spanish to meet him at Cajamarca was a very deliberate ploy. Given their numbers, they almost certainly posed no threat. And in the unlikely event that they did, where better to face them than right in the center of his power, surrounded by his armies? After all, his warriors outnumbered the Spanish by 500 to 1. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, of course, was absolutely everything. Atahualpa had so many warriors with him at Cajamarca that he couldn't possibly bring all of them into the city for his meetup with Pizarro, so he left the bulk of his forces at the hot springs just outside the city. That might sound like a rookie mistake, but it wasn't as risky as it sounds. Atahualpa still rocked up with some 6,000 men, 35 times the number of Spaniards. Those were still impossible odds. Or at least, they should have been. But here's where Atahualpa made a bit of a boo-boo. The Inca emperor wisely brought a huge force with him when he went to meet the Spanish, but crucially, he left behind the vast majority of his warriors, opting instead to surround himself with noblemen, priests, musicians, dancers, and servants, almost all of whom were unarmed. There were a few armed guards amongst the retinue, but they made up a very small minority. Again, in hindsight, that sounds just a teeny bit stupid. But Atahualpa's recklessness is actually pretty easy to understand. His position at Cajamarca was absurdly dominant. It simply never occurred to him that the Spanish would be crazy enough to try anything. From his perspective, the meeting was a purely diplomatic affair, and he was keen to impress the Spanish with the richness of both his culture and his coffers. Atahualpa was carried into the city's central plaza on a gigantic feather-covered litter carried by 80 of his most important officials, who themselves were decked out in ceremonial clothing and gold jewelry. If anyone would have been handing out style points that day, he would have received full marks across the board. But nobody was. In fact, when he arrived in the plaza, there was nobody there at all. The place was deserted. After a few, presumably somewhat awkward seconds, 2 men emerged from a building and approached the Emperor's litter. Not Francisco Pizarro and Diego Almagro, but a lowly friar, Vicente de Valera, and a native interpreter. This was not the kind of welcome the Inca emperor had been expecting, and this disrespect was about to get a lot worse. Friar Valera, who was apparently the proud owner of a truly gigantic set of Spanish bulls, handed the Inca emperor a Bible. Then, cool as you like, demanded that he convert to Christianity and become a subject of King Charles V of Spain. Given that he'd never heard of Catholicism, nor this King Charles bloke for that matter, Emperor Atahualpa wasn't overly impressed with these demands, and after flicking through a few pages of this Bible lark, he tossed it aside. Now that might sound pretty disrespectful, but in fairness to Atahualpa, not only was the holy book written in a language he didn't understand, the Inca didn't actually have written language in the first place. Their closest equivalent was a knot-based record system called quipu. Having had just about enough of the Spanish insolence, the Inca emperor prepared to unleash his wrath on the hapless friar. But he never got the chance. Because, at that moment, the Spanish attacked. It was an almost unimaginably bold move. In fact, to Atahualpa, there was no almost about it. It was quite literally unimaginable. Never in his wildest dreams did he consider the possibility that the Spanish would go on the offensive. It was like a Chihuahua suddenly attacking a Great Dane whilst out for walkies. Actually, that analogy doesn't really do it justice. If the 168 Spaniards were a Chihuahua, the Great Dane would need to be 15 meters tall to accurately represent the Inca. Chihuahuas are little shits, but even they wouldn't take on an enemy the size of a 5-story building. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that Pizarro's attack on the Inca at Cajamarca is one of the most audacious offensives in the history of warfare. This was suicide dressed up as battle tactics, and the Spanish knew it. Many of them had literally wet themselves in terror in the hours leading up to the ambush. These were battle-hardened veterans who'd seen more than their fair share of action across Pizarro's 3 South American expeditions, and even they all believed their position was hopeless. But as crazy as it was to take on the full might of the Inca at Cajamarca, the Spanish did have a couple of important advantages on their side. The first was obvious: surprise. As we've already seen, the Inca never considered the possibility of an attack, which is why they were so hopelessly unprepared when the trap was sprung. The second advantage was purely martial. The Inca were formidable warriors in their own right, but they had never fought Europeans before. And that meant they'd never faced guns, cannons, horses, or armor. Their introduction to these advanced military technologies came all at once in the space of a couple of minutes when the Spanish attacked. It was a baptism of fire. And blood. Lots of blood. Let's start with those guns. Known as arquebuses, the Spanish had only brought a grand total of 12 with them to Cajamarca. These weapons were long, unwieldy, and slow to load. Against an experienced force, they would have been good for a single volley at most in the close confines of the plaza. But to the Inca, these crappy old guns were basically magic, capable of killing a man at 50 paces with nothing but a bang and a flash of fire. Then there were the cannons, known as falconets. They were extremely small, barely a meter long, and designed more for portability and speed of deployment than pure killing power. But, once again, they were simply nothing like anything the Inca had ever encountered before. Both the arquebuses and the cannons were woefully inaccurate, but the plaza was so full of Inca, it made not a bit of difference. The Spanish couldn't miss. After the initial shots were fired, Pizarro sent in his cavalry, hidden from sight amongst the many alleyways that lined the plaza. This was an era where cavalry charges could shatter even well-armoured troops who were expecting them, and the Inca were neither of those. It's hard to overstate just how utterly devastating the Spanish cavalry were. There was no native analogue for those European war horses. The closest animal they were familiar with was the llama, and there's a reason no army in history has attempted a llama charge. Against the inexperienced Inca in the chaos of the plaza, the Spanish cavalry became unstoppable murder machines, carving death through the terrified masses before forming up to charge yet again. Finally, there was the European armour, which was far more advanced than anything the Inca had ever seen before. It didn't make the Spanish invincible, but it did render them largely impervious to most blows from standard Inca weapons, including clubs, slings, and small axes. It's worth pointing out that had Atahualpa brought his best warriors with him that fateful day, there's a good chance none of this would have actually mattered. Lethal though the Spaniards were, they would eventually have been overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers. But convinced he was untouchable, Atahualpa had left his soldiers outside the city. Put all these factors together and we're left with a simple truth. The Battle of Cajamarca wasn't really a battle at all. It was a slaughter. By most accounts, the Inca lost somewhere in the region of 3,000 men that day. The Spanish? Just one. And he wasn't even a conquistador, but an African slave who likely wasn't supposed to be fighting in the first place. Pizarro had executed the perfect ambush, but his aim wasn't simply to kill lots of Inca. There was method to this bloody madness. As the fighting kicked off, Pizarro and a few of his most trusted lieutenants made a beeline directly for Atahualpa. Dozens of Inca threw themselves in front of their emperor, willingly giving their lives to protect him. But the Spanish were unstoppable. They slashed their way through the crowd, and within seconds, Atahualpa was surrounded. One of Pizarro's men raised his sword to strike the killing blow, but at the very last second, Pizarro himself blocked the attack, receiving a nasty wound to his hand in the process. In the grand scheme of the Spanish conquest, Pizarro's tiny intervention may sound almost insignificant. But the fate of the entire Inca Empire hinged on that single split-second decision. Had Pizarro been a split second slower, Atahualpa would have been slain, and the entire Spanish conquest of the Inca would likely have failed. Because Pizarro's objective had never been to cut the head off the snake. He wanted to capture it. Had Atahualpa been killed in the melee, the 70-odd thousand Inca soldiers waiting outside would almost certainly have stormed the city and struck down the Spanish with great vengeance and furious anger. But by taking him alive, Pizarro paralyzed the Inca forces in a single stroke. The capture of the Inca emperor was also a huge psychological blow. Inca rulers were believed to be descendants of the sun god Inti, which made Atahualpa semi-divine in the eyes of his people. Seeing him in the hands of the enemy was both confusing and terrifying. Combined with the utter chaos going on inside the city, it sowed panic in the Inca ranks. Panic that spread virally through the Inca army gathered outside the city, causing tens of thousands of veteran warriors to rout despite never actually facing the enemy head-on. The Battle of Cajamarca literally couldn't have gone any better for the Spanish. Had Pizarro sat down the night before and scripted the whole thing himself. Atahualpa was placed under house arrest, but otherwise treated impeccably. Though this was probably more about self-preservation than respect of a foreign ruler. After all, Atahualpa was quite literally the only reason Pizarro and his followers were still alive. In exchange for his safety, the Inca ruler had ordered what remained of his army to stand down, buying the Spanish the time they needed to consider what the hell to do next. Because Pizarro may have just won the battle, but the war was only just beginning. At this point, Atahualpa still believed the Spanish would, at some point, let him go. Oh, that sweet summer child. So, rather than resist his captors, he went into negotiation mode. In return for his release, the imprisoned Inca ruler offered to fill his entire cell with pure, solid gold. Coming from almost anyone else on the planet, that would have been laughable, but the Spanish had already seen plenty of evidence that Atahualpa could put his gold where his mouth was. And to sweeten the deal, he also offered to fill 2 adjoining rooms with silver. 3 entire rooms filled to the ceiling with precious metals in exchange for a single life? That wasn't just an offer the gold-hungry Francisco Pizarro couldn't refuse. It was an offer he could scarcely believe. But Atahualpa was as good as his word, and within 2 months the rooms were stacked to the ceiling with gold and silver artifacts from across the Inca kingdom. The Spanish wasted no time melting everything down into solid gold ingots, with a total worth just north of $500 million in today's money. Pizarro and his band of conquistadors were now stupendously rich. But unfortunately for Atahualpa, they weren't feeling particularly charitable. The Inca emperor had come through on his side of the bargain, but the Spanish were having second thoughts about theirs. Letting the Inca leader go was simply too big of a risk, so instead they came up with an alternative deal. They would keep all of the gold and silver, but rather than set Atahualpa free, they'd burn him at the stake instead. Yeah, the old switcheroo, I guess. The Spanish justified their outrageous bait and switch by accusing the emperor of 3 crimes: worshipping false idols, polygamy, and treason against the Spanish crown. The Spanish did give Atahualpa the chance to prove his innocence in a totally not fixed trial, but given that 2 of his crimes were an established part of Inca culture, it was always going to be an uphill struggle. In a verdict that surprised nobody, presumably not even Atahualpa himself, he was found guilty on all counts. Shocking. At the last minute, he was given the option of converting to Catholicism in return for a reduced sentence. Well, sort of. He agreed and was baptized under the name Francisco in honor of the man who had just stolen his empire. In return for this final humiliation, Atahualpa was granted a marginally less horrific method of execution. Instead of being burnt at the stake, he was merely garroted. With Atahualpa out of the way, it was time for phase 2 of Pizarro's grand plan: capture the Inca capital, Cusco. On paper, that looked borderline impossible. Pizarro's Spanish Inquisition had managed to defeat Atahualpa through its chief weapon, surprise. Surprise and guns. His 2 chief weapons, surprise and guns, and cavalry. His 3... You get the idea. The point is, there was no chance whatsoever of pulling off the same trick twice. This time, the Inca would be ready. That meant Pizarro needed a new approach. And once again, he was able to borrow a play from Cortez's Conquering the New World Empires for Dummies textbook. The Inca and Aztecs were 2 very different civilizations, but they had something important in common. Their empires were built by conquering and assimilating dozens of smaller kingdoms and city-states. In the case of the Inca, that process had been incredibly fast. When Pizarro showed up in the 1530s, the vast Inca Empire was barely a century old. That meant the majority of its new territories had been captured within living memory. Like the Aztecs, the Inca were hard on their newly acquired citizens. There were forced resettlements, regular labor drafts, and heavy tribute demands, all of which bred resentment. Cortez had leveraged similarly divided loyalties during the conquest of the Aztec, positioning himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. That nifty bit of PR had worked spectacularly, with hundreds of thousands of native warriors agreeing to fight alongside him. If Pizarro wanted to capture the Inca stronghold of Cusco, he was going to have to pull off a similar trick. The first order of business was to install a new emperor on the Inca's feathered throne. The man they chose for the job was Tupac Hualpa, and to begin with, it looked like an extremely astute move. As one of the many sons of former Emperor Huayna Capac, Tupac Hualpa had royal blood and was therefore a legitimate ruler in the eyes of the Inca nobility. But he was also politically weak, with little support from any particular slice of Inca society. On paper, he was perfect. But unfortunately for the Spanish, just 2 weeks into his reign, Tupac Hualpa dropped down dead. Some historians believe he died of natural causes, likely an illness of some kind, but others suspect poison may have been involved, most likely delivered by his own people, who recognized that he was effectively a puppet emperor fully under Spanish control. Personally, I think he faked his own death to avoid the fame and moved to Cuba. Or maybe I'm thinking of somebody else. Luckily for Pizarro, Huayna Capac's generous family planning principles meant there were plenty of other candidates to be his next Pinocchio. In the end, he settled on a man called Manco Inca Yupanqui, Manco to his mates. Compared to Tupac Hualpa, Manco was a significantly riskier appointment. At just 17, he was young, ambitious, and popular amongst the Cusco nobility. Some might say dangerously popular. But from Pizarro's perspective, Manco had one very important thing going for him: a burning hatred of Atahualpa's key supporters in Cusco. During the Inca Civil War, Atahualpa had attempted to exterminate his key rivals, in other words, his brothers, and Manco Inca had been forced to go into hiding. Now he was out for revenge, and if that meant siding with the foreign invaders, so be it. It was a match made in Conquistador heaven. Their combined forces marched on the Inca capital, meeting fierce resistance along the way from forces still loyal to Atahualpa. In theory, the Inca still had huge military strength to call upon, but it was scattered and loyalties were divided. That allowed Pizarro, along with his huge army of Inca allies, to divide and conquer, winning a series of key battles on the long march to Cusco. By the time they got there, Inca resistance had all but crumbled, and the capital was taken with ease. It was a huge moment in the conquest of the Inca. But Pizarro didn't hang around to celebrate, because now that the Inca resistance was largely broken, he had a colony to build. Leaving 2 of his brothers behind, Hernando and Gonzalo in charge of Cusco, Pizarro headed back to the coast. If Peru was going to be a successful colony, it was going to need a new capital with better connections to Spain. On the 18th of January 1535, Pizarro founded a brand new city. Officially, it was named Ciudad de los Reyes, the City of Kings. But even in those days, it was commonly known by a different name, Lima. It remains the Peruvian capital to this day. Once Lima was established, the real work of conquest began. Taking Cusco had broken the spine of Inca authority. But the empire itself was enormous. Thousands of kilometers of mountains, valleys, and provinces still answered to local lords and generals who had no intentions of surrendering. So the Spanish fanned out. Small columns of cavalry and infantry, augmented by native auxiliaries, were dispatched in every direction, following the old Inca road network to every corner of the empire. Some regions submitted the moment Spanish banners appeared on the horizon. Others fought bitterly. But slowly and surely, town by town, valley by valley, the Inca were beaten back. By the late 1530s, most of the Inca heartland had been absorbed for a relentless grind of patrols, skirmishes, negotiations, and opportunistic alliances. But back in Cusco, things were not going well, at least not for the Inca. Ostensibly, Manco was in charge, but in reality the empire was being run by a couple of hundred Europeans who didn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture, and had no intentions of sharing power. Hernando and Gonzalo proved to be rather less diplomatically savvy than their brother, barely making any effort whatsoever to keep up the pretense of Inca independence. They treated Manco not as an emperor, but as a mascot useful for wheeling out at important ceremonies, and not a lot else, to be honest. At first, Manco played along, still believing he could use the Spanish to rid him of his enemies before rebuilding the empire in his own image. But it soon became clear that would be impossible. The Pizarro brothers ignored his orders and openly mocked him at every opportunity. When they casually took two of his wives for their own pleasure, Manco decided he'd had enough. It was time to cut the strings. He attempted to slip out of the city unnoticed, but he was captured and thrown into prison. Despite the setback, he didn't give up, and during his incarceration, he continued to plot against his captors. Eventually, he managed to convince them to release him so that he could recover a valuable golden artifact from a nearby temple. Apparently, he'd already figured out that the way to a conquistador's heart was through his wallet. Manco was released, along with an armed escort, but he had no trouble giving them the slip. Within a matter of weeks, he'd gathered a huge army, as many as 100,000 men according to some estimates. And he marched them straight back to Cusco to exterminate the Spanish. On paper, this battle should have been a foregone conclusion. 100,000 angry Inca against a couple of hundred Spaniards. But once again, the conquistadors had help. Inca society was so badly fractured that there were still plenty of people willing to fight alongside the Spanish against Manco. According to most estimates, the tiny Spanish force at Cusco was augmented by as many as 30,000 native warriors. The siege of Cusco has gone down in the history books as a battle between the Spanish and the Inca. But the truth is, the Spaniards only accounted for about 0.6% of the Spanish side of the siege, and only about 0.1% of the total combatants. In terms of raw numbers, this was basically another Inca civil war, one that the Spanish took full advantage of. Manco laid siege to Cusco for almost an entire year, and he came within a whisker of taking it on more than one occasion. But the Incas somehow clung on long enough for Diego Almagro, who'd been off discovering Chile on an expedition all of his own, to arrive with reinforcements. Manco was forced to retreat, beaten, at least for now. But this isn't the last we'll see of him. The Inca would never return to Cusco, and the beating heart of their once great empire was now firmly in Spanish hands. For the conquistadors, it was finally time to sit down and celebrate yet another classic New World conquest. Or at least it should have been. But the conquistadors were so fond of conquering that the moment the Inca were beaten, they quickly found a new target: each other. Having just relieved the defenders during the siege, Diego Almagro decided it was the perfect time to stage a coup, throwing the Pizarro brothers in jail and declaring himself governor of Cusco. Bet you didn't see that one coming. In truth, this little conflict had been brewing for some time. Almagro had been quietly fuming ever since hearing that Charles V had done the dirty on him in the capitulation of Toledo by granting Francisco Pizarro basically everything. That had never sat well with Almagro. As far as he was concerned, he and Pizarro were partners. Now that the war with the Inca was largely won, he expected to receive his fair share of the loot. Considering he'd saved the Spaniards' jamon with his reinforcements during the siege of Cusco, the Inca capital seemed like a fitting reward. Unsurprisingly, over in Lima, Pizarro saw things very differently. Luckily, they were both reasonable men So they sat down over a nice hot cup of tea and agreed on a compromise that was fair for both of them. Just kidding, they immediately declared all-out war. This bizarre civil war would last about a year, with two of Pizarro's brothers, Hernando and Gonzalo, ultimately defeating Almagro's army just outside of Cusco, in what is known as the Battle of Las Salinas. Like Atahualpa 4.5 years earlier, in the aftermath, Diego Almagro was put to death by garroting. That didn't go down particularly well back in Spain. Hernando Pizarro would eventually end up spending 20 years behind bars for murder. But, in principle, the killing should have been the end of the Pizarro-Almagro civil war. Unfortunately, there was one small problem. Diego Almagro had a son. His name was Diego Almagro II. The Pizarros had killed his father. Now they must prepare to die. Almagro II, also known as El Mozo, didn't quite command the following his father had, but he did have a few close allies loyal to his cause. On June the 26th, 1541, those allies stormed Francisco Pizarro's palace in Lima, overpowered the guards, and murdered the man who had conquered the Inca. El Mozo attempted to install himself as governor of Lima, but lacking the support to pull it off, he was soon forced to flee back to Cusco. By this point, things had gotten so chaotic, the Spanish crown was forced to intervene. The conquistadors had done a grand old job of securing this new colony, but their habit of murdering everyone at the drop of a hat was pretty convincing evidence they just weren't fit to rule it. Charles V dispatched special investigator Cristobal Vaca da Castro to Peru to attempt to bring things under control. The first item on his to-do list was to track down and execute the renegade El Mozo. Once he ticked that off, he marched to Lima and installed himself as governor. El Mozo was the last of the Almagro line, but a few loyal Almagrists were still at large in Cusco. Fearing for their lives at the death of El Mozo, they fled into the highlands to seek succor from the most unlikely of sources. After the siege of Cusco, Manco Inca had not simply given up, he'd gone underground. Withdrawing into the dense jungles of the highlands, he'd busily established what we now call the Neo-Inca state. A kind of mini-empire that was part resistance movement, part secret civilization. From his hidden capital at Vilcabamba, Manco ruled what remained of his father's once proud empire, striking out at Spanish settlements when he could, and sheltering anyone who was willing to fight the new order. Including, remarkably enough, the last desperate survivors of the Almagro faction. It was a decision Manco Inca would soon come to deeply, deeply regret. Actually, that isn't entirely accurate. He didn't regret it at all, because he was already dead. About a year after taking the rogue conquistadors into his care, they murdered him in cold blood after a drunken argument. Inca vengeance was swift and brutal, and all but one of the Spaniards responsible were killed in the immediate aftermath. Whilst the Inca were tearing the last Almagro loyalists' limbs from their torsos in the jungle, elsewhere in Peru, the Spanish were doing what they did best, gearing up for yet another civil war. Yay! The Spanish crown's attempt to regain control of the colony was not going down well with the men who'd originally conquered it. In 1542, a comprehensive set of new rules and regulations, known as the New Laws of the Indies, was issued directly from Spain. The idea was to civilize the unruly colony and, more importantly, to systematically strip power from the conquistadors. The main sticking point was a law that removed hereditary transfer of encomiendas, which were essentially pocket-sized fiefdoms built on forced indigenous labour. Encomiendas were the primary economic incentive for conquistadors, so taking them away retrospectively was unpopular. To enforce these new laws, Charles V decided Spanish Peru needed something it had never had before: a professional governor who wasn't a homicidal gold-hungry maniac. He chose a man called Blasco Núñez Vela for the job, naming him the first viceroy of Peru. Núñez Vela arrived in Peru in 1544, and from the first moment his feet touched dry land, he became one of the most hated men on the continent. The conquistadors had no intention of giving up the spoils of conquest without a fight. Who saw that coming? And so they elected a new leader to spearhead yet another rebellion. Really, there was only one man for the job, the last surviving Pizarro brother still on the continent, Gonzalo. The royalists and the rebels would meet at the Battle of Inaquito in 1546, with the rebels coming out on top. In truth, it was a pretty one-sided affair. Gonzalo Pizarro was a wealthy man with significant resources who enjoyed broad support amongst former conquistadors, and he had no trouble at all raising an army large enough to crush the royalist forces. When the fighting was over, Blasco Núñez Vela, Peru's first viceroy, was beheaded on the battlefield. The rebellion had won, and the colony of Peru was now operating entirely independently from the Spanish crown. Back in Spain, this news went down like a gold balloon. The prospect of a rogue empire under the control of Gonzalo Pizarro was unthinkable, but fixing the problem wasn't exactly straightforward. As we've seen, Pizarro was militarily strong, and taking back Peru by force would have required launching an entire armada from Spain. That would have been both time-consuming and expensive. So, in the end, Charles V took a different and highly unusual approach. He didn't send an army to Peru. He sent a priest. His name was Pedro de la Gasca, and he was about as threatening as a damp flannel. He had no troops, no gold, and no noble lineage. What he did have was something even more valuable: a royal commission that gave him the authority to offer pardons, negotiate settlements, and crucially, quietly ignore the hated new laws wherever he saw fit. La Gasca rocked up in 1547 and made it known that any rebel who defected back to the crown would be given a full pardon and allowed to keep their treasured encomiendas. In other words, they would be given everything they'd wanted in the first place, with no repercussions whatsoever. All they had to do was abandon the rebellion. Gonzalo Pizarro never stood a chance. His men defected to La Gasca by the hundreds, with every lost man effectively becoming a soldier for the enemy. La Gasca played his hand to perfection, wisely avoiding direct confrontation for long enough that by the time the two forces met on the battlefield, Pizarro was badly outnumbered and easily beaten. When the fighting was over, Gonzalo Pizarro was given the same treatment he dished out to Núñez Vela 2 years earlier. He was beheaded on the battlefield. Gonzalo's execution marked the end of an era. After a storming start at Cajamarca, the Spanish had spent more time murdering each other than ruling their new colony. But with the death of the last Pizarro, the world's weirdest series of civil wars were finally at an end. Pedro de la Gasca assumed control of the new colony. The new laws were quietly reinterpreted into something the ex-conquistadors could live with, and royal authority was restored for long enough for Peru to become a productive part of the Spanish Empire. But there was still one loose end to tie up. Deep in the cloud forests of the Andes, the Neo-Inca state, founded by Manco Inca after his dramatic escape from Spanish custody, was still alive and well. After Manco's murder in 1544, the mantle of leadership passed through several of his children, until in 1571, his youngest son, Tupac Amaru, was named emperor. It wasn't until Viceroy Francisco de Toledo arrived in 1569, the first strong, long-term administrator Peru had ever had, that Spain finally had both the stability and resources to finish the job Francisco Pizarro had started 3.5 decades earlier. In 1572, Toledo launched a full-scale campaign into the Vilcabamba Valley, overrunning the Neo-Inca capital and shattering the last independent remnant of the empire. Tupac Amaru fled into the jungle, but Spanish patrols hunted him down and dragged him back to Cusco, where he was publicly executed in the plaza his ancestors had once ruled. His death marked the end of the Neo-Inca Empire, and with it, the final flicker of a civilization that had once ruled from Colombia to Chile. After almost 40 years of rebellion, civil wars, assassinations, and secret jungle kingdoms, the long story of the Spanish conquest of the Inca was finally over. And what a story it was! Arguably one of the greatest tales history has ever told. One of ambition, betrayal, and empires rising and falling in real time. Almost none of the protagonists in this grand epic would live to see its end. The Inca emperors were persecuted over the decades until none of them remained. And the Spanish conquistadors who started this whole mess in the first place were almost all swallowed up by the very violence they helped unleash. Of course, the story of the Inca didn't actually die with Tupac Amaru in 1572. He was the last of the Inca emperors, but tens of thousands of ordinary Inca citizens lived on. Today, the legacy of the Inca is still very visible if you know where to look. You can see it in the old imperial language of the Inca that millions still speak, Quechua. You can see it in the festivals that blend Catholic saints with ancient mountain spirits. And in the stonework the Spanish built their palaces on top of because they couldn't figure out how to move it. Civilizations rise, empires fall, and history moves on. But the echoes of the Inca can still be heard in the Andes. Thanks for watching.